I'm going to tell you the story of a new, young, dumb pastor at the very beginning of her career. It's me. My first appointment was as an associate pastor at the two big temples of old Methodism in old Springfield, right downtown. Now, one of the churches had started a contemporary service the year before I came, and they had applied for a grant from the Missouri Conference to buy all the equipment, but by the time I got there, the service had already died, and the people who led it had already left. So the church handed me authority over this grant spending and said, "Go get us young people, please." So I started an alternative worship service. It met on Friday nights after dark. It was kind of an underground church. You'd get invited, you'd come, you'd be on the team. I hired a young evangel student who was a real out-of-the-box thinker named Paul as an intern. With candles, a set of giant sheets across the front, a projector, and a stereo we bought at Best Buy, we transformed that very traditional worship space every night into an immersive worship experience that changed some lives. It was always different. It was sometimes surprising. Like this morning when you had last week's slides or some other week's slides up there, we would do that stuff on purpose so that we would have to really listen, because we really listened, right? It was sometimes amazing. It was creative and risk-taking, and it attracted college students, other pastors, and a lot of people who had been hurt in the name of faith, or people who had been hurt by Sunday morning church but still had or wanted to find faith in God. And sometimes the fire department showed up. I mean, we weren't real in control. It was edgy and a lot of work, but the worship experiences were very impactful for new disciples, old disciples. It was not surprising by the end of that service time if someone would come forward who declared themselves an atheist at the beginning of the service and wanted to be baptized right there. We had spontaneous baptisms in a United Methodist Church, which is almost unheard of. And I'm still friends with many of the people who were part of that service, and they still bring up to me some of the shared experiences we had in my first 2 years of ministry. It was wild. But we really did something together, and it stuck with us. And it was very much something we did together. It wasn't my ideas. It was immersive. People participated. People talked. They got up and moved around. They switched seats. Anyone could ask questions at any time. So the service could shift to deal with whatever that person had asked, whatever someone needed to deal with that day. And they gave space to each other and space to me. If someone fell apart during communion, everyone just sat and prayed while we dealt with the fallout. If someone got up and walked out, a team of people that knew that person or had said hi to them would go after them. There were no expectations of how we behaved in the service. They just waited on the Lord to do whatever God was doing, and God did things here. And the people who came made room for God to do things there. They helped God do things there. They expected God to do things there. They knew that how they responded to anyone who came in the door mattered. So they weren't observers of something that had been prepared for them. They shared in what happened. They gave us all the ideas. Someone just had to name a concept, and we would run with it. sometimes to disastrous ends, and sometimes to wonderful ends. But it was Paul, the intern, who had the idea to do a service about God's promise to Moses of a land flowing with milk and honey. That's a powerful concept, a land running, flowing with milk and honey. And it would have been a very powerful concept to Abraham's descendants. It would have been a powerful promise to those descendants sitting in Egypt enslaved, and then to those people wandering in the wilderness on a desert journey. Someday, they would say to each other, someday, the promise of plenty, the promise of enough, the promise of freedom and land, which would have been huge to these landless people. The promise of milk and honey is the promise of vegetation, of enough land to have your cattle on. The promise of honey is the promise of blooming flowers, enough space to settle down and share it with your animals. A land flowing with milk and honey is a promise of a time of peace and joy and enough. So Paul the intern found some inspiration in that, and he had written an original piece of music he wanted to present, and he'd worked with a few handpicked members of the choir, and they were going to do this ensemble debut of his piece of music, and all he needed from me to do the milk and honey service was to figure out a way to move the worshipers out of the space they expected to worship, the sanctuary, and take them on a journey to another place. A journey that would mimic crossing the Red Sea. He said, this will be easy, right? Just figure this out, Pastor. And then wherever we ended up to worship had to feel like a desert. Had to feel like a desert. And then the small ensemble would sing the scripture he'd put to music, and then I would lead a quiet discussion about what it means to be in the desert, longing for the promised land, and there would be milk and honey. Because once the Israelites make it out of slavery by following Moses and this promise, they still had to wander for a long time, right? They didn't just walk out of Egypt and have houses. They had to wander for a long time. They had to learn to hope and live on the promises of God. And that's what he wanted us to do in this place that felt like a desert. Now, at the back of that sanctuary, in the room that's called the narthex, there was a hidden door, a choir passage, a piece of the wall that you could open that led from the basement choir room up to the back of the sanctuary for those Sundays when the choir processed in. And only the choir and the custodian ever used that passage, and it was rarely used. So very few people knew this passage existed, especially the people who came on Friday night. I thought that would be the perfect place to lead them on a wilderness journey. How cool is it that you can push on the wall and suddenly you're in a new passage? Fun. So we set that up, thinking that would work, because it led to the choir room, which was half set up as a choir room. It was a huge room, and half of it was just an empty part of the room with a piano in it. It was a very special choir room led by Dina Weaver's cousin, Rosemary, who was a professor at Drury. Right? And she ran that choir very well. She and Marty would get along well. And using her choir room was the equivalent of using Marty's choir room. It was just bigger, and part of it was empty. So we made the stairwell feel like the Red Sea. There was blue everywhere. There were water sounds. There were streamers. It was a little dark, a little scary. But then it opened up into this big space that could become a desert. How do you make a choir room in a church basement feel like a desert? Well, at 47 today, I would tell you to just give everyone a packet of an individual sand packet, and you could stick your finger in the packet and then remove your finger and close it, and then we will sweep and mop afterwards. There's your sand. But I didn't know then what I know now. 10 years ago, I would have put some big planters or bins around the room with sand in them, and everyone could sit around them in clusters and stick their hand in and have the sand experience, and then we'd have to get the bins out. But I didn't do this when I was 37. I did it when I was 27, before I learned to ask questions like, how are we going to clean this all up? So to make the desert, I used the elevator to bring bags of sand down into the choir room. And I opened all 50 bags. And I put 2,000 pounds of sand in the choir room. We had dunes. We had dunes of sand. And then we spread around candles and stations of milk mixed with honey. It was the most unique worship space I had ever experienced. I was so excited to share it with all the people. And we got everybody there, and we told them, hey, tonight we're not worshiping in here. We're going to go on a journey somewhere you maybe have never been before. And the young people got so excited, and I suggested they take off their shoes because I knew what was waiting for them. And they were pulling their shoes off and making a big pile of shoes, and they were so excited. And the lay leader of the church, which is what Kurt is now here, the lay leader of the church was there. He was recently retired. He was very open-minded, but that night his mind slammed right shut. And he suddenly felt very unsafe in this place that was made to be intentionally safe. And I ended up, while everyone lined up, all excited and shoeless, to get in the line to go to wherever we were going, he just fell apart in the pew. And I went and sat with him, and they just stood there, shoeless, and waited without pressuring. The service would start when it started. And I got to chat with him. He had lots of objections and worries because I wouldn't answer his questions. Why are we moving to a different space in the church? What kind of worship can we not do in the sanctuary? What have you done? What have you done? Why? Do I even want to know about this? Because I am on church council. Do I even want to know? Why won't you tell me what is going to happen? But his burning question was, why do I have to take off my shoes? Because I don't take off my shoes around shoes. Taking off your shoes at church, it's too vulnerable. I'll be shoeless at church. And I said, wow, you're really afraid of the unknown. Really afraid of the unknown. How many of us are willing to risk losing out on great experiences? Because we might have to take off our shoes. We might have to go one step too far. We might have to actually trust the people we say we trust. We might have to go somewhere that's outside our comfort zone, which is what's called the growth zone, right? Because that's where we grow. And growth means change, and change is awful. Awful. So he and I talked about his fear of the unknown while the lion waited for us patiently, and I told him, Phil, you will be missing out on something really special. And I asked him to trust me. And we took off our shoes, and we joined the queue. And from the back of the line, we got to hear the gasps as the people made their way through the passage, down the secret staircase of the Red Sea, and stepped into a full-blown desert in downtown Springfield. And the choir ensemble appeared, and somehow one of them had a key to the Christmas pageant costume closet, and they had all dressed up like characters from I don't know why. They were all in the head things and robes, and they were grinning, and they began to sing, and they were clearly just so tickled to get invited to join in the hijinks. It was an amazing night. It was vulnerable and intimate when what we had to confront was the same thing that we all confront. When we decide, like Moses did, to follow God to freedom, we do so on a promise. But it doesn't make everything easy. God doesn't just hand us milk and honey because we believe, right? We sometimes have to go somewhere new to get to the land God has prepared for us. We sometimes have to try a different thing than we ever wanted to try. So as we confronted that in that 2,000 pounds of sand, people began to talk about what they were really struggling with and what made their life a wilderness today. And we talked about our hopes for the future. What would milk and honey look like? And then we drank milk and honey and we remembered God's promises. The light was low, the sand was deep, and then we just dismissed everybody and they left so excited. And then the staff turned on the lights and someone looked at me and said, "So how are we getting all of this sand out of here?" And I said, "I wish you'd have asked me that yesterday." And they said, "Where are we going to put the sand if we get it out of here?" And I said, "That feels like a yesterday question too." With the lights on and the Spirit of God out of the room, we were in a little bit of a bind. It's not easy to get somewhere new, right? And sometimes as church folks, the path we take to give people a great experience or to have a great experience ourselves means a lot of dirty work behind the scenes. And then we worry about whether we can get people past their fear of the unknown to try something new. These are the struggles of risk-taking ministry, but they're also the struggles we have as we negotiate risk in our lives. So the team decided to come back the next morning with every tool we had at home that we thought could help us. I don't know why there was a snowblower there, but we were trying to figure out anything we could do. And by the time we showed up as the worship team to fix this the next morning, most of the sand was gone. And the first person I ran into was the lay leader with the snow shovel. Grinning. So we swept and vacuumed and hauled and mopped and disposed of sand anywhere we thought we could hide it on the church property in Springfield, which is why that, I don't know what kind of land analysis they do there, but it's very sandy, St. Paul downtown. The downtown church is very sandy. So if you feel inspired to ask me after the service, why don't we have a service like this? I want you to just say, "Thank you, Susan Newcomb." Because our chair of maintenance, after hearing this story, said, "No, we're not doing that." It's hard work. I was exhausting. A land flowing with milk and honey is what God promises Abraham's descendants. Not now. Not soon. It's already inhabited by a bunch of people who think it belongs to them. They're going to give you a really hard time because they think they live there. You're going to be enslaved for a while. And then you'll come out with this guy Moses. But then you'll wander in the wilderness in the desert for 40 years. But then it will be yours someday. And it will be enough. There will be enough. It won't always be peaceful, but it will be good and spacious. The land will flow with milk and honey. At 27, as a new pastor, I thought I had one life. Everybody in their 20s trying to figure out who they are, what they're supposed to do with their life. I had it. I win. Now I just got to do what God says and it'll be easy. Right? I got a super strong relationship with God. I had options for what to do. I just had to do the right thing and God would take care of me and life would be hard. It was not like I thought. And that worship service full of people who were telling each other the truth about how challenging they found life, they helped me figure out where God shows up and how God shows up in people's lives, including my own. We sometimes, you may not want to admit this, but here's what I hear. We sometimes get mad at God because we expected more. We expected easier. We expected church people to always be nice people. We expected peace. We expected milk and honey every day in a cup ready for us, refrigerated to the right temperature. And when we're like that, when we're mad because it didn't look like we thought it would look like, we are, to borrow the words from Zeke Cook, who is at Unite right now with our other youth, we are judging a fish for how it climbs. When we get mad at God, because it's not like we thought it would be, we're judging a fish for how it climbs. Fish don't climb. We're getting upset because we misunderstood what fulfillment would look like. We just want to believe, we want to have it all go easy and not take off our shoes and not have to dispose of sand. It has never been easy. Never been easy for me. But I wasn't promised easy. Ever. It has never been not frustrating. But I wasn't promised my call in a frustration-free packaging. My career hasn't always been free from political intrigue in the conference. But I wasn't promised carefree. My life isn't any easier or better than yours because I'm a pastor, because all of us, disciples of Jesus Christ, followers of God, we get the same deal. The promise of better, intense moments of connection, glimpses of the risen Christ walking in our midst, spiritual food when we are starving, the promise of enough, the hope of better, the promise of blooming flowers and plants all around and enough space, moments of enough, moments of peace, moments of joy, a God strong enough to put up with us, still love us, and pull us through whatever we get stuck in. The God who is strong enough to identify God's self to Moses as, I am who I am. We can look at the Israelites, we do this all the time, and think, oh, cluck, 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 they didn't get it. But it's harder to look in the mirror. And it's harder to take off our shoes, to go where God needs us to go. But, and I rarely say this, and I'll never say it to you in an email, trust me. Trust me this one time. It's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be pretty. Sometimes the fire department is going to get called. It's not always going to be carefree. But life following God is full of moments that if you hang on will pull you through. The God who pulled Moses through the Red Sea, the God who pulled the Israelites through the desert, the God who pulled me out of downtown Springfield is the God who will pull you through. And the land will flow with milk and amen.